They told him service in the Astra Militarum would bring honor. They never mentioned the nightmares that waited between battles, or the truth about what happens to those who survive too long. The mud was already over their boots when the whistle blew. Garen Holt felt the cold seep through the seams, biting at his ankles, as the line lurched forward into the pre-dawn murk. Lasguns were held tight against their chests like talismans, though everyone knew they were little more than candles in a storm against what waited out there. The rain had not stopped for 11 days, and the trenches stank of rot, promethium, and fear. Garen adjusted the strap on his pack, fingers stiff from cold and nerves. Beside him, Velez muttered a half-remembered hymn to the Emperor under his breath. Ahead, Corporal Drake's silhouette cut through the gloom, trench coat snapping in the wind, Vox speed hissing orders from command. They'd been told this was a push. Minor resistance, command had said. A short engagement. Garen had heard the same before Castron Hill. He still remembered what was left of that minor resistance, the screaming, the sky on fire, the shadows that moved in ways flesh shouldn't. But there was no time to think. The whistle meant move, and in the guard, hesitation killed quicker than enemy fire. The climb from trench to the no-man's land was slick and uneven. Mud clung to boots like it wanted to drag them back down. Garen pulled himself up with shaking hands, eyes adjusting to the dim gray light. The world ahead was a scarred plain of craters and broken razor wire, the kind of place where sound carried strangely and hope got lost in the mist. They moved in formation, 50 men spread out in a rough crescent, bayonets fixed. Somewhere far ahead, artillery thundered. Not Imperial. It was too guttural, too wet. The first shell landed short, a distant flash followed by a rolling boom that Garen felt in his chest. A few of the younger troopers flinched. Drake barked something over the Vox, his voice cracking like a whip. Garen forced his breathing steady. One step. Another. It was always like this at the start. Before the chaos began, there was this slow, awful walk through the dead zone, where your thoughts got too loud and every heartbeat sounded like a countdown. The ground ahead erupted. A geyser of mud and bone shot skyward, screams. Someone had hit a mine. The line faltered for a moment, but Drake's voice dragged them forward. Garen didn't look at the crater. He had learned early that looking only made the next step harder. Velez stumbled beside him, face pale beneath the grime. "Saints preserve us," he whispered. Garen didn't answer. His hands were numb on the lasgun grip, his jaw clenched so tight it hurt. Then the mist ahead shifted and they saw movement. Not much, just a ripple like heat over sand, but every guardsman felt it. The ripple grew, resolved into shapes. Garen squinted. For a heartbeat he thought they were men until he saw the way they moved. Too many joints. Limbs bent at wrong angles, chittering, wet sounds. The first of the enemy broke through the fog and the line fired. Red beams lanced out, a ragged volley of panic more than precision. Shadows fell, but more came. The sky lit up as mortars began to fall. Command had underestimated, again. Garen's section broke into a run as artillery rained down, mud splashing, men shouting over the din. Something screamed overhead, not human, and a moment later the forward platoon disappeared in a gout of black fire. Garen didn't think. He dove for cover in a shell crater, dragging Velez down with him. Drake followed a second later, swearing into his Vox. "This isn't minor," he bellowed. The reply was static, and the distant roar of something alive. Garen peeked over the lip of the crater and froze. The fog was burning away in the artillery heat, and what lay beyond was worse than anything he'd imagined. The enemy line wasn't a line at all. It was a swarm. Things with too many limbs and faces stretched into perpetual hunger were crawling over each other to reach them. Tyranids. Emperor helped them. The realization hit like a physical blow. He'd heard stories in the barracks, whispered at night when the lights were out. Whole regiments gone in hours. Planets devoured, and here they were, walking straight into the teeth of it. The front ranks opened fire, but it was like throwing pebbles at a tidal wave. The last beams cut through chitin and flesh, but for every creature that fell, 3 more took its place. Artillery screamed overhead, both sides hammering the ruined plain. A shockwave from an impact threw Garen sideways. His ears rang, vision swimming. When it cleared, he saw Velez clawing at his side, blood seeping through his coat. A shard of shrapnel jutted from his ribs. Garen grabbed him, dragging him deeper into the crater as Medici crews scrambled past. "Hold on," Garen hissed. Velez's eyes were wide, unfocused. Above them the Tyranid swarm hit the forward lines. Screams rose, a chorus of human terror cut short by claws and teeth. Drake climbed out of the crater, rallying the remnants of their unit. "Up, form on me," he shouted. Garen hesitated. The swarm was too close, but orders were orders. He shoved his fear down where it always went and hauled himself up. Around him, men did the same, faces set in that hollow mask every guardsman wore when death was too near to think about. The clash was sudden and brutal. Bayonets met alien flesh. Garen thrust, fired, swung, barely aware of what he was doing. A creature loomed in front of him, its maw splitting into 4 dripping jaws. He shot point-blank into its face. It fell thrashing, nearly dragging him down. Someone behind screamed for help. Garen turned and saw Velez on the ground, a Tyranid warrior bearing down on him. Garen didn't think. He charged, lasgun blazing, slamming into the creature's flank. It turned, hissing, claws raking. Pain ripped across his shoulder as it struck, but Drake's blade came down from the side, severing its head in a spray of black ichor. For a heartbeat, Garen met Drake's eyes. There was no victory there, only grim understanding. This wasn't a battle they'd win. This was survival measured in minutes. The Vox crackled with frantic voices. Command was pulling back. The order came through, retreat to secondary positions. Drake roared for them to fall back. The line fractured as guardsmen scrambled over the churned mud, some dragging wounded, others simply running. Tyranids surged after them. Garen grabbed Velez under the arms, dragging him backward through the chaos. Lasgun fire lit the mist like lightning. Artillery thumped. Somewhere a basilisk fired, its shells screaming overhead before detonating with earth-shaking force. The retreat became a rout. Garen's lungs burned, his shoulder throbbed, his legs felt like lead, but he didn't stop. Velez's weight was deadening, but leaving him wasn't an option. They stumbled toward the fallback trenches, where commissars stood with bolt pistols ready, not at the Tyranids, but at any guardsman who faltered. When Garen finally collapsed behind the secondary line, gasping, covered in mud and blood, the sun had risen fully. The battlefield was a sea of bodies. The swarm had been pushed back for now, but everyone knew they would come again. Drake limped past, barking orders. Medici teams dragged the wounded into dugouts. A priest walked the line, chanting benedictions, his voice hoarse but steady. Garen stared at his hands. They were shaking uncontrollably. Velez lay beside him, unconscious, pale. And in that moment, Garen understood the truth that every guardsman eventually learns. The worst part wasn't the fighting. It was the waiting. The quiet between assaults, when you had time to think about the next one. When you had to live with the memory of what you just survived, knowing it would happen again, and again, and again. Somewhere beyond the trenches, the swarm shrieked, a sound like the galaxy itself tearing open. Garen closed his eyes. The day had only just begun. The trench was too quiet after the swarm's retreat. Garen had always hated that silence more than the artillery, more than the screams. It wasn't peace. It was the world holding its breath, waiting for the next blow. He sat with his back against the sandbag wall, his coat soaked through, watching Velez on the stretcher. The Medici had removed the shrapnel and pumped him full of stimulants to keep him from slipping too far, but the wound was deep. Velez's eyes fluttered open for a moment, glassy and unfocused, and Garen grabbed his hand. "Stay awake," he muttered. "You hear me? You're not checking out yet." Velez tried to speak but coughed instead, a wet rattle that made Garen's stomach tighten. Around them, the trench bustled with forced activity. Men cleaned their weapons with hands that still shook. Officers barked orders to keep people moving. Priests walked between squads, muttering prayers and anointing foreheads with sacred oils. Commissar Rin stalked the walkways like a carrion hawk, his black greatcoat swirling in the damp wind, his bolt pistol always loose in its holster. He didn't have to speak for the troopers to straighten when he passed. One glance from those sharp, cold eyes was enough. Garen had seen Rin execute 3 deserters in the past month, all quick, all efficient. "Reinforcements coming," someone asked down the trench. The answer came back hollow. "Command says maybe by nightfall, if the transports make it through the storm." Garen didn't bother hoping. Promises of reinforcements were like promises of leave, something to keep you breathing, not something to believe in. The sky was already darkening, heavy clouds bruised purple by the distant bombardments. If the Tyranids returned before help arrived, they'd be fighting with half their strength and fraying nerves. Drake appeared, mud-caked and limping slightly, his cap pulled low over his brow. He stopped in front of Garen, eyeing Velez. "He'll live." Garen shrugged. "If the Emperor wills it." Drake grunted, then crouched beside him. "Command wants two-man scouting parties to check the eastern approach, see if the swarm is regrouping." Garen stared at him. "You're joking, they'll eat scouts alive out there." "Orders," Drake said simply. His face was lined with exhaustion, the kind that no amount of sleep would ever fix. "You and Corrin are up. You leave in 10. Garen opened his mouth to argue but stopped. There was no point. In the guard, arguing with orders was like shouting at a wall. You only hurt yourself. He rose slowly, bones aching from cold and adrenaline crash, and went to find Corrin. He spotted him near the supply dugout, checking the charge pack on his lasgun. Corrin was younger by a decade, but his eyes already had that distant, worn look of someone who'd seen too much. "Scout duty," Garen said. Corrin snorted. "Lucky us." They packed light extra power cells, a flare gun, a ration pack neither expected to use. Night fell fast on that broken world, and by the time they climbed out of the trench, the last light was fading behind the clouds. They moved low and quiet, crouched figures against the shattered landscape, weaving between craters and barbed wire like ghosts. Garen hated scouting missions. The battlefield after dark was worse than hell. It played tricks on the senses. Shadows moved where nothing should. Distant echoes became whispers you swore you understood. The eastern approach was a series of ridges and ravines carved by centuries of bombardment, perfect terrain for ambushes. They advanced slowly, scanning with their rifle-mounted lamps, but the mist swallowed the light after a few meters. The wind carried strange sounds, half organic, half mechanical. Garen exchanged a glance with Corrin. Both heard it. Both pretended they didn't. They reached the crest of a ridge overlooking a ruined hab-block settlement that had been shelled to rubble in the early days of the campaign. The buildings were skeletal remains, jagged walls jutting like broken teeth. Garen knelt, peering through the scope. At first he saw nothing but debris and shadows. Then movement. Something skittered through the ruins fast, low to the ground. Then another. And another. "Emperor's mercy," Corrin whispered. "They're massing." Below them the Tyranids were gathering. Hundreds at least, maybe thousands. A churning mass of claws and chitin, all moving with terrible purpose. At the center something larger loomed. A creature taller than a lemon rust tank, its carapace ridged like fortress walls, its multiple eyes glowing faintly in the dark. Garen didn't know what it was, but every instinct screamed that this was worse than the last attack. Much worse. They needed to get back. Garen tapped Corrin's shoulder and motioned to retreat. They moved as quickly and quietly as they dared, retracing their path, but the wind shifted, carrying their scent, or perhaps the swarm had simply known they were there all along. A screech split the night, so high and sharp it made Garen's vision blur. Shapes burst from the ruins, racing toward the ridge. "Run," Garen barked, "no point in stealth now." They sprinted across the broken ground, lungs burning, hearts hammering. The swarm was fast, far faster than any human could hope to be, but the terrain slowed them just enough. Lasgun shots cracked through the darkness as Corrin turned and fired at the pursuing shapes. One fell, but more followed. Garen could hear their claws tearing into the mud behind them, the wet slap of alien flesh. They dove into a ravine, sliding down the slick wall, hitting the bottom hard. Garen's breath came in ragged gasps. Corrin looked up, face pale, and raised his weapon. "We're cut off," he hissed. Shapes moved along the ridge line above them, blocking the path back. "Flare," Garen said, fumbling for the launcher. Corin fired it upward, a streak of red light piercing the gloom. The moment it popped, the creatures screeched in unison and surged down the ravine walls. Garen and Corin fired wildly, beams carving through the darkness, cutting down the first wave. But there were too many. Just as Garen thought they were finished, last beams from the trenchline lanced across the night. A squad had seen the flare and opened fire from range. Explosions from mortar shells followed, lighting the night like false dawn. Garen grabbed Corin by the collar. "Move!" he shouted over the din. They scrambled through the chaos, mortars slamming into the ravine, Tyranids shrieking as they were torn apart. Garen didn't look back. They stumbled back into the trench minutes later, covered in mud and shaking. Drake met them halfway, eyes hard. "Report," he snapped. Garen gasped out what they'd seen. When he mentioned the massive creature, Drake's face darkened. "Emperor, help us," he muttered. He didn't waste time. Orders were shouted down the trench line. Vox operators relayed the warning to command. The swarm was regrouping for a full assault. Word spread fast. Reinforcements hadn't arrived. Ammunition was low. Morale was lower. Garen returned to his post beside Velez's stretcher. The younger man was conscious now, barely. His lips were cracked, eyes sunken. "They're coming again," Garen said quietly. Velez nodded weakly. There was no fear in his eyes anymore, just the dull resignation of someone who'd seen too many waves. The sky lit up again hours before dawn. The attack came not as a slow build, but as an explosion of movement from every direction. The trenches erupted in lasfire as the swarm poured over the ridges like a living tide. Garen snapped into motion, firing until the barrel of his gun glowed. Tyranids slammed into the forward positions, claws ripping through sandbags and flesh alike. Commissar Rin stood atop the firing step, bellowing prayers and threats in equal measure, bolt pistol roaring. The massive creature Garen had seen earlier appeared through the smoke, a behemoth of chitin and muscle. Artillery fire slammed into it, but it kept coming, shrugging off explosions like rain. A basilisk shell struck its flank and barely slowed it. It roared, a sound that made Garen's bones ache, and hurled itself against the trench line. Garen's world became noise and light and blood. The trench walls shook as the creature smashed into them. Men were thrown like dolls. Garen grabbed Velez's stretcher, dragging him toward the rear trench as the line collapsed around them. Drake was shouting something, but Garen couldn't hear over the chaos. Above them, the sky burned with flares and muzzle flashes, a hellscape painted in red and orange. And then through the madness, Garen saw something that froze him. The creature wasn't just attacking, it was searching, ripping through positions with an uncanny, deliberate focus. Its many eyes glowed brighter as it moved toward the command dugout. Garen didn't know why, but a sick certainty settled in his gut. Whatever that thing wanted, if it found it, none of them would leave this battlefield alive. The trenches were no longer trenches. They were slaughterhouses carved into the mud. Garen staggered through choking smoke, his hands slick with blood that wasn't all his own, dragging Velez's stretcher over shattered planks as the swarm howled behind them. The ground trembled with every impact from the massive Tyranid creature as it tore through the forward defenses, splintering the firing steps, caving in dugouts, and crushing screaming men beneath its bulk. Vox lines crackled with desperate, overlapping voices, officers shouting orders no one could hear, squads screaming for support that wasn't coming. Garen pulled the stretcher behind a collapsed sandbag wall and dropped to his knees, gasping for air that reeked of promethium and burning flesh. Velez's eyes fluttered, his voice a thin rasp. "We're dead, aren't we?" Garen shook his head, but the lie didn't carry any weight. He could hear it in his own breathing, ragged, desperate, the sound of someone already standing too close to the edge. Down the trench, Corin was firing into the smoke, yelling something Garen couldn't make out. The last beams carved through the haze, striking skittering shapes that appeared and vanished like nightmares. Men were pulled screaming into the darkness. Others died where they stood, shredded before they could even turn. The commissar's bolt pistol boomed again and again, each shot a thunderclap, and over it all came the endless shrieking chorus of the Tyranids. "Garen," Drake's voice cut through the chaos like a blade. Garen turned to see him pushing through the mass of retreating guardsmen. Blood streaked down one side of his face. "Command dugout's been hit," he barked. "We're falling back to the second line." Garen glanced toward the command position. He couldn't see it through the smoke, but he could feel the direction of the attack, the ground-shaking impacts, the concentrated screams. The massive tyrannid was there. He knew it. That unnatural, deliberate searching. It hadn't been a random rampage. Something inside that dugout was its target. "Help me with him," Garen shouted, nodding toward Velez. Drake didn't hesitate. Together they lifted the stretcher and began moving down the trench, stumbling past scenes that would haunt Garen's dreams forever. A trooper pinned beneath a collapsed beam, clawing at the mud as tyrannid talons dragged him backward. A priest standing in the open, arms raised to the sky, chanting litanies as the swarm closed on him from all sides. A Vox operator still transmitting, even as a gaunt creature tore into his back. As they rounded a corner, Garen nearly collided with Commissar Rin. The man's greatcoat was shredded, his cap gone, his face streaked with soot and blood, but his eyes, those cold, sharp eyes, were still blazing. "You will hold the second line," he bellowed to the fleeing troopers. "Anyone who turns back, anyone who falters, will answer to me before they answer to the enemy." He raised his bolt pistol meaningfully, and several panicked soldiers stumbled back into formation. Rin saw Garen and Drake hauling Velez and jerked his chin. "Get him to the rear aid station, then get back to the line." Garen wanted to protest, to say there wouldn't be a line left to hold if that creature wasn't stopped, but Rin's glare froze the words in his throat. "You didn't argue with commissars. You didn't even think about it too loudly." They reached the aid station, a shallow dugout reinforced with corrugated metal, where wounded lay packed shoulder to shoulder, the air thick with blood and fear. Medici worked frantically by the light of flickering lamps, their hands moving with desperate efficiency. Garen and Drake set Velez down on a blood-slicked cot, and a Medici immediately descended on him, checking vitals, injecting more stimulants. Velez grabbed Garen's sleeve weakly. "Don't leave me," he whispered. Garen hesitated, then squeezed his hand. "I'll be back," he lied, and turned away before he could see the fear in the younger man's eyes. Outside, the retreat had turned into a brutal, chaotic brawl. The second line wasn't so much a prepared fallback position as a ragged stretch of trench and sandbag walls hastily reinforced over weeks of desperate fighting. Guardsmen poured into position, some taking up firing posts, others simply huddling where they could find cover. The air was alive with shouts, screams, and the thudding of boots as squads scrambled to reorganize. Garen found Corrin crouched behind a makeshift barricade, swapping out a burned power pack. His face was smeared with grime, but his hands were steady. "They're coming through the breaches already," he said grimly. "If that big one breaks the second line, we're finished." Drake slammed a new power cell into his own lasgun. "Command's trying to get artillery support on it," he said, "if the Vox still works." As if on cue, the ground shuddered again, a rolling tremor that sent dust cascading from the trench walls. A moment later, a thunderous roar split the night. The massive tyrannid had reached the second line. Garen peered over the sandbags and saw it emerging through the smoke like some colossal nightmare, its armored carapace glistening with blood and ichor, its clawed limbs tearing through defenses like paper. Behind it, the swarm flowed in its wake, a tide of claws and teeth and alien fury. "Fire!" someone screamed, and the trench erupted in lasgun volleys. Beams lanced across the darkness, slamming into the creature's hide, but it barely seemed to notice. Mortar shells exploded around it, showering it with mud and shrapnel. A missile streaked in from a heavy weapons team and struck its flank in a burst of flame, but the creature only roared louder, charging forward with terrifying speed. The impact shook the trench like an earthquake. Men were thrown off their feet, sandbags burst, walls caved in. Garen fired until his rifle overheated, then ducked as claws swept overhead, tearing through the barricade like wet parchment. The creature's head loomed above the trench, its many eyes glowing in the firelight, its jaws opening wide in a shriek that drilled straight into Garen's skull. And then something unexpected happened. From deep within the command dugout, now half buried under debris, came a strange pulse. A flicker of blue-white light, bright enough to cut through the smoke for an instant. The creature froze. Its eyes locked onto that light, and its furious, chaotic movement suddenly sharpened, focused entirely in that direction. Garen felt it like a pressure in the air, a shift in the rhythm of the battlefield. Drake saw it too. "It's after something," he muttered, "in the command bunker." The realization hit Garen like a physical blow. "Then if it gets there, it's over," he said. Corin glanced between them. "What do we even have that it wants?" Garen didn't have an answer, but whatever it was, command clearly hadn't evacuated it. And now the creature was plowing through everything between it and its target. If it reached the dugout fully, it wouldn't just destroy it. It would carve a path straight through the heart of their defense. An urgent call rang out over the Vox. "All available squads converge on command. Hold the creature back at all costs." Garen's stomach twisted. At all costs usually meant one thing in the guard: none of us are making it out alive. They ran. Through collapsing trenches, through choking smoke and bodies piled high, Garen, Corin, and Drake pushed toward the center line. Around them, the defense was faltering. Soldiers fired blindly into the advancing swarm. Officers screamed themselves hoarse. Mortars boomed in erratic rhythms as crews were overrun mid-loading. The night had become one endless roar of death and desperation. When they reached the half-collapsed command bunker, Garen understood why the creature wanted it. In the rubble, surrounded by dead officers and shattered equipment, a stasis container lay glowing faintly with that same blue-white light. He couldn't see what was inside, but the light pulsed rhythmically, like a heartbeat. And just as he saw it, the creature slammed into the defenses around the bunker. The world became dust and light and terror. The shockwave knocked Garen off his feet. He landed hard, his vision spinning, ears ringing. Through the haze he saw the monster forcing its way closer, shrugging off fire from every direction, its focus unwavering. Something inside that container was drawing it like a beacon. And whatever that something was, Garen realized with cold clarity that they weren't fighting to hold the line anymore. They were standing in the path of something far bigger than themselves, something that could decide the fate of the entire campaign. And the creature was almost there. The world dissolved into smoke, screaming, and the thunder of things collapsing. Garen rolled to his side, coughing as grit filled his throat, and wiped mud and blood from his face with a trembling hand. The creature's roar echoed off the shattered trench walls, a sound that made the air itself feel thin and brittle. Drake grabbed him by the shoulder and hauled him upright, shouting something Garen couldn't hear over the din. Around them, guardsmen were forming a desperate ring around the half-buried command bunker, lasguns blazing, heavy bolters chattering into the darkness. But the swarm wasn't just coming, it was pouring forward, a tide of bodies and claws and shrieks that swallowed the defenses like fire consumes dry brush. Garen stumbled after Drake and Corin toward the bunker's entrance, which was half-blocked by collapsed beams and sandbags. Medici and officers were hauling the wounded out, trying to evacuate the remaining personnel before the defenses gave way entirely. Vox operators clutched their receivers to their ears, faces pale as they screamed for artillery support that wasn't coming. Somewhere overhead, a Valkyrie gunship roared past, its heavy bolters spitting lines of fire into the swarm. But even from here, Garen could tell it wouldn't be enough. The Tyrannid tide was too large, too fast. Inside the bunker, the air was thick with heat and desperation. Generators hummed unevenly, throwing flickering light across cracked walls and hastily scrawled tactical maps. The stasis container lay at the center of the room, set atop a reinforced table, its glow pulsing steadily like the heartbeat of some alien god. Officers crowded around it, their voices sharp and clipped, urgency crackling in every word. Garen caught fragments as he pushed closer. Evacuation point compromised. We can't move it without proper shielding. That thing knows it's here. Drake shoved past a pair of harried adjutants and slammed his hands down on the table. "What's in there?" he demanded. "Why is it coming straight for this spot?" One of the officers, a grizzled major with a scar running down his cheek, shot him a glare. "Classified. Now get your men outside and hold the line. That's an order." Drake didn't back down. With what? Half the regiment's either dead or scattered. Whatever's in that box, it's about to get a lot of people killed. Before the major could retort, a low vibration ran through the floor. Dust sifted down from the ceiling. The walls groaned. The creature was close. Garen looked toward the entrance just in time to see a flash of movement outside, a glimpse of chitinous limbs tearing through sandbags. Heavy bolters roared. Screams followed. Corin leaned close to Garen, eyes wide. "You feel that? It's like the whole damn world's holding its breath." He was right. In that moment between impacts, there was a strange, hollow silence, as if even the swarm was waiting for something. And then the creature struck. The wall nearest the container exploded inward in a rain of debris and mud. The tyrannid's head thrust through the breach, jaws splitting wide, eyes glowing with a feral, purposeful hunger. Officers were thrown like rag dolls as the shockwave rippled through the bunker. The major was hurled across the room and hit the opposite wall with a wet crack. Alarm screamed. The creature forced its claws through the gap, widening it with terrifying strength, tearing concrete like paper. Garen stumbled back as a support beam snapped, crushing 2 troopers beneath it. Drake yelled for everyone to fall back, his voice raw and furious. Corin grabbed Garen's arm and pulled him toward the side exit as the creature rammed forward again. The breach widened. More tyrannids were pouring in behind it now, smaller ones, chittering, darting along the walls and ceiling like swarming insects. "Set charges," someone shouted. "Bring the whole bunker down if you have to." But Garen's eyes were fixed on the stasis container. It hadn't moved. Amid the chaos, amid the screaming and gunfire and collapsing walls, it sat there pulsing steadily, almost calmly, like it knew this would happen. The glow intensified as the creature drew closer. They burst through the side exit into the trench beyond, only to find it already collapsing into chaos. The second line was folding fast. Vox chatter was nothing but screams and static. Garen saw men abandoning their posts, some fleeing toward the third line, others simply breaking and running into the night. Commissars fired into retreating backs to keep the line from shattering completely, but the tide was too strong. The tyrannids were everywhere now, skittering over trench walls, pouring through breaches, leaping into dugouts. Drake grabbed Garen by the collar. "We hold here or we're done," he barked. His face was streaked with blood, his eyes burning with that desperate fire Garen had seen before, the fire of someone who knew he wasn't fighting to win anymore, only to buy time. They set up at the edge of the trench, joining what remained of their platoon. Corin slammed a new power cell into his lasgun and spat into the mud. "Just like Castron Hill all over again," he muttered. Garen almost laughed, but it came out as a strangled breath. The memories of that slaughter still haunted him at night. Back then, they'd believed reinforcements were coming. This time, he wasn't sure there was anyone left to send. The creature emerged from the bunker in a shower of debris, dragging the stasis container with it in one massive claw. It hadn't destroyed it, it had taken it. Garen's blood ran cold. Whatever was inside that container, the tyrannids wanted it intact, and that meant it was far more dangerous than anyone here had been told. Drake saw it too. "We can't let it reach the swarm with that thing," he said. "If it does—" He didn't finish the sentence. He didn't have to. The major, bloodied but still on his feet, staggered out of the collapsing bunker, clutching a Voxcaster. "All artillery batteries target the command position. Fire for effect." For a second, Garen thought he'd misheard. He stared at the major, stunned. "Sir, we're still here." The major didn't look at him. "That's an order." And then Garen understood. They weren't going to save the container. They were going to bury it, along with everyone and everything still in this sector. The first artillery shells screamed overhead. The ground erupted in massive plumes of fire and mud as the batteries opened up. Shockwaves rolled through the trenches. Tyranids and guardsmen alike were torn apart by the blasts. The creature roared, shielding the container with its massive body, but even it staggered under the bombardment. Garen was thrown into the trench wall by the first blast, ears ringing, vision white. He clawed his way back up, choking on smoke, just in time to see Drake rallying what was left of the platoon. "Keep firing," he bellowed. "We make them pay for every inch." They did. Lasgun spat crimson light into the advancing swarm. Heavy bolters thundered. Mortars exploded in gory showers. The trench became a killing ground, but the swarm didn't care. They climbed over their dead over the shattered barricades, relentless. Garen felt his power pack run dry, slammed another in with shaking hands, fired again. A gaunt leapt into the trench and was met with a bayonet thrust to the throat. Another followed, and another. Above it all, the creature still moved toward the swarm's rear lines, clutching the container, shrugging off artillery blasts like they were rain. It was hurt now. Black ichor streamed from its wounds, but it wasn't slowing down. Garen's mind raced. If it reached the hive fleet with that container, whatever was inside would be delivered straight into the heart of the swarm. He didn't know what it was, but he could feel the wrongness radiating from it. This wasn't just another relic or strategic asset. This was something that should never have been unearthed. "Drake," he shouted over the chaos, "we have to stop it." Drake glanced at him, breathing hard, eyes blazing. "Then let's make this count." They pushed forward through the crumbling trench, fighting their way toward the creature. Every step was a battle, every few meters another life lost. Corin went down screaming when a clawed limb slashed across his leg. Garen dragged him into a dugout, left him with a bloodied trooper, and kept going. Shells rained down, the ground shook, the sky burned. When they finally reached the edge of the killing field, they saw it clearly. The creature lumbering toward the swarm with the container, surrounded by a knot of smaller tyranids like a living escort. Artillery pounded all around it, but it moved with terrible purpose, ignoring everything except its goal. And Garen knew, with a sickening certainty, that if someone didn't stop it now, there wouldn't be a later. The mud clung to Garen's boots like it wanted to keep him from moving, dragging him down as the world shook apart around him. The air was choked with smoke and chemical stink, the sharp tang of ozone and blood hanging thick as he and Drake pushed through the ruined trench. Somewhere overhead, the artillery was still screaming in, the thunderous blasts so constant now they merged into a single, endless roar that rattled teeth and bones alike. Around them, men were dying in droves, not in clean, heroic bursts but in ugly, sprawling heaps, trampled by their comrades or torn apart by the creatures pouring through the breaches. The bombardment had turned the front into something unrecognizable, a churning landscape of flame and ruin, a hell that didn't stop burning even when the shells fell silent for brief, deceptive lulls. The creature was still ahead of them, lumbering through the storm like something dredged up from the worst of humanity's nightmares. It carried the stasis container tight against its plated chest, massive claws curled protectively around it, as if even this thing, this killing engine bred for extinction wars, understood its importance. A knot of smaller tyranids swarmed at its heels, shielding it from the worst of the bombardment. They moved like a single organism, precise and synchronized, flowing around obstacles, vaulting shattered earthworks, cutting down anything foolish enough to get close. Garen's heart slammed against his ribs as he watched it, not with fear anymore, but with the clarity of grim, unyielding resolve. Drake skidded to a halt beside a half-collapsed dugout, breath coming in ragged gasps, his uniform torn and splattered with mud and blood. "We can't take that thing head-on," he yelled over the chaos. "We'll be shredded before we get within 10 meters." Garen's eyes flicked toward a ridgeline of broken ferrocrete to their right. Artillery shells had torn it open, leaving jagged slabs leaning against one another like rotten teeth. Beneath it, a shallow maintenance tunnel gaped black. "We don't need to," he shouted back. "We cut through there, flank it while it's moving toward the swarm. If we can get close enough, maybe we can blow the damn thing apart." Drake's gaze followed his, and after a heartbeat he nodded. "Corin," he roared, looking back down the trench. The younger man was limping but still moving, a crude bandage wrapped tight around his thigh. He caught up, lasgun clutched in blood-slick hands, his face pale but eyes fierce. "You're insane," Corin said between breaths, glancing toward the creature. "But I like it better than dying in a trench." "Tunnel now," Drake ordered, and they plunged toward the gaping hole. The entrance stank of decay and promethium, the reek of something that had died down there mixing with the damp rot of ancient soil. Garen switched on the small lumen at his belt, the light cutting through the darkness in a weak, flickering cone. The tunnel sloped downward, narrow and rough, the walls lined with cracked support struts and broken cables. They moved quickly but quietly, the sound of the battle above fading into a distant rumble. Down here, the air was thick and still, pressing close against their lungs. Garen's mind wandered unwillingly to the stories he'd heard whispered around barracks fires, about things that lived in the old tunnels, creatures too strange or broken to face the surface. But there was no turning back now. As they pushed deeper, the tunnel widened slightly, enough for them to move side by side. Drake took point, lasgun raised, his movements careful but decisive. Corin followed, muttering half-coherent prayers under his breath, the words blending with the drip of moisture from the ceiling. Garen brought up the rear, his thoughts flicking again and again to the container. Whatever was inside had changed the flow of the battle. The enemy wasn't simply destroying them, they were recovering something. And the brass hadn't told them a damn thing. A sound echoed through the tunnel then, a faint, rhythmic tapping like claws against metal. They froze. The light from Garen's lumen caught movement ahead, a brief flash before disappearing into the shadows. Corin swore under his breath. "Tell me that's just the pipes settling." Drake didn't answer. He motioned forward silently, eyes narrowed. They advanced slowly now, every sense straining. The tapping grew louder, closer, until suddenly a shape burst from a side passage, a gaunt, its pale exoskeleton gleaming in the lumen light, its jaws splitting in a wet hiss. Drake fired first. The last bolt took it in the chest, burning a hole clean through. Corin followed with a shot to the head, splattering the tunnel wall with ichor. The creature crumpled, twitching. Garen's heart hammered in his chest, but they didn't stop to stare. More would come. They ran. The tunnel bent sharply and then rose upward, leading to a cracked grate that opened out onto the churned killing ground behind the creature's path. Through the gaps, Garen could see it clearly now, moving steadily toward the distant, looming shadow of the swarm's leading edge. In the sky beyond, shapes writhed and twisted, spore ships descending, their bloated forms trailing strings of bioluminescence. The ground trembled with their approach. Drake pried the grate open, and they hauled themselves out one by one, crouching low behind the shattered ferrocrete slabs. They were closer than Garen had hoped. Less than 50 meters separated them from the creature. Close enough to see the steaming wounds left by artillery strikes, the way its carapace flexed with each step, the way the stasis container pulsed like a living thing. "What's the plan?" Corin hissed. Garen patted the satchel slung at his side. A demolition charge, standard issue but powerful enough to collapse a bunker. "We get close, plant this on its underbelly or the container itself, and pray the Emperor's listening." Drake glanced at the charge, then at Garen. "You're not walking away from that." "I know," Garen said simply. There was no bravado in it, just quiet certainty. Corin looked between them, his expression hardening. "Then we make sure it counts." They moved, slow at first, creeping through the broken terrain, ducking beneath shattered beams and crawling through mud-filled craters. The smaller Tyranids were focused outward, scanning for threats from the main line, not behind. For the first time all night, luck was with them. Halfway there, the creature stopped. Its massive head tilted slightly, and Garen felt a chill crawl down his spine. It was listening. Somehow it sensed them, not their footsteps, but something deeper, like it could feel their intent bleeding into the air. The escorts tensed, their bodies shifting subtly, ready to pounce. Drake froze mid-step, hand raised. Corrin's breathing hitched audibly. Garen's fingers tightened on the detonator. If they were spotted now, they wouldn't make it another meter. Seconds stretched into eternities. Then, just as suddenly, the creature turned away again and continued forward. Garen exhaled slowly, his hands shaking. They closed the remaining distance in a desperate rush, timing their movements with artillery impacts to mask the sound. Garen ended up at the creature's flank, so close he could smell the acrid stench of its wounds. He slid beneath its massive frame, mud coating his uniform, heart pounding so loudly he was sure the escorts would hear it. The underside was a lattice of armored plates and organic tubing. He found a gap near the base of the chest, where the container's support tendrils merged with the creature's own flesh. Perfect. He pulled the satchel charge from his pack, pressed it into place, and armed it. The timer was set for 30 seconds, no more, no less. When he slid back out, Drake and Corrin were waiting, covering him. "Done," he gasped. "Then we run," Drake said. They sprinted back toward the broken ridge, every step a prayer that the escorts wouldn't notice until it was too late. 20 seconds. Artillery fire intensified again, shells raining down closer and closer. 15. A screamer killer bellowed somewhere in the distance, the sound rolling like thunder. 10. Corrin stumbled, but Drake caught him, dragging him onward. 5. They dove behind the ferrocrete, just as the charge detonated. The explosion was like a miniature sun erupting beneath the creature. A shockwave punched through the air, flattening everything within 50 meters. Garen's ears rang as mud and shards of chitin rained down. When the smoke cleared, the creature was down on one knee, its underside torn open, black ichor gushing out. The container was cracked, its glow flickering wildly. But it wasn't dead. With a roar that shook the ground, it pushed itself back upright. The escorts swarmed around it, shielding it from further attack. The container's pulsing became erratic, almost frantic. Garen stared at it, a sick feeling coiling in his gut. The explosion hadn't destroyed it. It had awakened something inside. The thing inside the container began to scream. It wasn't a sound carried through the air, but through the earth, through the marrow of the bones, through the broken metal slabs and mud-churned trenches. Garen clamped his hands over his ears instinctively, but it did nothing. The vibration bypassed flesh and skin, digging directly into the skull like a drill. Corrin dropped to his knees beside him, teeth clenched in silent agony, blood leaking from one ear. Drake swore hoarsely, dragging Corrin back behind the ferrocrete, as the ground itself seemed to buckle under the pressure of that otherworldly wail. The escorts went berserk. The smaller tyrannids began tearing into the corpses around them, not to feed, but as if they were searching for something, like scavengers driven mad. The larger creature staggered, the cracked container in its arms thrumming with increasing intensity, light spilling through the fractured shell in brilliant, erratic bursts. The air grew thick with static, every hair on Garen's body standing on end. The smell of ozone and something far older filled the battlefield. "Emperor, help us," Drake rasped. His voice was small against the storm. The sky cracked open as if in response. A new barrage of artillery rained down, but this was different, targeted. Dozens of precision strikes slammed into the area around the creature, as if the Imperium's command had finally noticed what was happening and decided that whatever was in that container could not, under any circumstances, reach the swarm's main line. The ground convulsed. Trenches collapsed. A munitions cache somewhere behind them ignited in a chain reaction, sending a pillar of flame curling upward into the smog-choked sky. Garen pulled himself upright, every joint screaming in protest. "We have to move," he shouted over the din. "To where?" Corrin yelled back, his voice raw. His eyes were wild, his bandaged legs soaked through with fresh blood. Drake pointed toward the half-buried command bunker on the ridge to their left, its ferrocrete walls cracked but still standing. There. We regroup there, figure out if anyone's left alive to call this mess in. They moved, half running, half stumbling through the shifting earth as the bombardment intensified. Garen risked a glance back, and almost wished he hadn't. The container split open. The thing inside wasn't a weapon in the traditional sense. It wasn't a tyrannid, at least not in any recognizable form. It was human, or had once been, a child-sized figure, hairless and pale, its limbs spindly and too long, its eyes black from edge to edge. Ribbons of tubing and chitin had been grafted into its flesh, fusing human anatomy with alien biostructures in grotesque harmony. Its mouth opened, releasing another of those subsonic wails that made the ground quake. The escorts fell into formation around it, not attacking but kneeling, as if they were in the presence of something greater, something sacred. What in the throne's name? Corrin breathed, stumbling as he tried to keep moving. They've been experimenting, Drake said grimly, eyes fixed ahead. Or harvesting. Emperor forgive us, maybe both. The implication hit Garen like a hammer. This wasn't just a battle. It was a retrieval operation. Whatever that childlike creature was, the swarm wanted it back desperately enough to throw thousands of lives into the grinder. And the Imperium had been keeping it, hiding it, using it for something. The thought made his stomach churn. They reached the command bunker just as another artillery strike landed close enough to throw them against the outer wall. Drake forced the rusted hatch open, and they tumbled inside, gasping for breath. The interior was chaos, flickering lumen strips, overturned equipment, blood smeared across the walls. But there were survivors. Sergeant Riva stood in the center of the main chamber, her face streaked with grime, one arm in a makeshift sling. She stared at them as they entered, disbelief flashing across her features. Garen, Drake, Emperor's mercy, I thought the front line was gone. It is, Garen panted, but that's not the problem anymore. Riva's gaze shifted past them toward the battlefield outside. We saw the bombardment. What happened? The container broke, Drake said. Something came out, you need to see this. She didn't hesitate. Together they climbed the bunker's observation ladder to a narrow slit in the upper wall. Through it, they had a clear view of the ridge and the devastation below. The childlike creature was standing now, surrounded by a knot of tyrannids. Its black eyes stared straight toward the Imperium lines, unblinking. It raised one thin arm and the artillery stopped. Not slowed. Stopped. Every gun, every distant boom fell silent in the same breath, as if the battlefield itself had been muted by a single, terrible will. Riva's face drained of color. Throne preserve us. Then the world bent. There was no other way to describe it. The air shimmered like heat haze, the ground rippled like water, and every living soul felt something clawing at the edges of their mind. Garen stumbled back from the slit, clutching his head. Whispers slithered through his skull, words in a language he couldn't understand but instinctively feared. He saw flashes, planets burning, hive fleets blotting out the stars, a vast intelligence staring down at humanity like a man might regard ants. It's a psyker, Corrin choked out. It's a bloody psyker. Not just that, Drake cut him off, voice trembling despite himself. It's a beacon. Outside, the creature's wail rose again, and this time it was answered. From the sky, new spore pods began to fall, thousands of them, trailing greenish fire through the smog. The swarm was converging, drawn by that impossible signal. Riva snapped into command mode, voice sharp as a whip. Get me Vox contact with command, now. There is no contact, one of the comms officers shouted back from the corner. They pulled out the primary network hours ago. We're on our own. Panic rippled through the survivors. Some began barricading the bunker entrances, others simply stared at the slit, paralyzed. Garen forced himself to focus. Panic was death here. We can't hold this bunker, not against what's coming. We don't need to hold, Riva replied, jaw tightening. We need to kill that thing. Cut the beacon, maybe, just maybe, we can buy enough time to retreat before the swarm fully lands. Drake looked at her like she'd lost her mind. You saw what happened out there. That thing stopped artillery. We've got maybe 24 half-dead guardsmen and a handful of rifles. We can't kill it. We have to, she snapped, unless you want to sit here and wait to be eaten alive. The bunker shook as the first spore pods landed nearby, each impact sending clouds of debris through the air vents. The distant chittering grew louder. Time was running out. Corin leaned heavily against the wall, eyes unfocused. We're dead anyway, he muttered. Might as well make it mean something. Garen stared at the observation slit again, at that small, impossible figure standing at the center of an army. He thought of everything he'd seen since the moment he'd signed his recruitment papers. The propaganda, the promises of glory, the endless drills, the way every man who survived long enough eventually grew quiet and hollow-eyed. He thought of the child, and the swarm, and the way the Imperium had hidden this nightmare beneath layers of orders and silence. A decision clicked into place, cold and solid. I'll do it, he said. Every head turned toward him. I planted the charge once, Garen continued. I can get close again. You just need to keep their attention off me long enough to make it count. Drake's eyes narrowed. You won't make it back. I know. Silence settled over the room for a heartbeat, broken only by the distant screech of descending spore pods. Then Riva nodded slowly. If you're willing, we'll give you every second we can. Outside, the ground shook harder. The swarm was nearly upon them. The bunker was alive with desperate energy. Orders were shouted over the shriek of incoming spores, boots pounded against cracked ferrocrete floors, and the sour smell of sweat and fear hung heavy in the air. Garen stood in the corner near a battered equipment locker, hands moving automatically as he checked his remaining gear. One demolition charge left, a half-spent lasgun power cell, a combat knife dulled by mud and bone. His hands didn't shake, not anymore. The decision had settled something deep inside him, like a man staring down a storm and realizing there's no shelter, only the choice to stand or run. Corin limped over, his bandaged leg dragging, a battered canteen in one hand. He shoved it toward Garen. Drink, you're going to need it. Garen almost refused, then took it and drank deep. The water was warm and metallic, but it cut through the dry ache in his throat. You shouldn't be walking on that, he muttered. Corin smirked faintly. I shouldn't be alive either, but here we are. He sank down against the wall beside Garen, grimacing as the pain in his leg caught up. You really mean to go out there, alone? Garen didn't answer right away. He stared at the cracked demolition charge on the table, its dull metal casing scarred by shrapnel. Someone has to, he said finally. That thing, whatever it is, if it keeps calling, the whole sector's done. We die here or we die slower somewhere else. Corin exhaled shakily. You know, when I signed up, they told me it was for honor, for the throne, for protecting humanity. I didn't think it'd be this. Garen's mouth twitched, not quite a smile. None of us did. Before either man could say more, Riva's voice cut through the bunker like a blade. Positions, incoming. They scrambled up the ladder to the observation slit. Outside, the ridge had vanished beneath a carpet of writhing tyrannid organisms. The first wave of gaunts had reached the perimeter, scuttling over broken walls and razor wire like ants over a carcass. Behind them, the larger beasts lumbered forward, living artillery pieces belching spore mines into the air. The sky itself seemed alive, a swirling mass of descending pods trailing green fire, blotting out the stars. And at the center of it all, standing perfectly still amid the chaos, was the childlike creature, the Psyker beacon, its black eyes unblinking, its thin arms spread slightly as if embracing the nightmare. Riva slammed her fist against the wall. They're coming in from every angle. We hold as long as we can, buy him time. Her gaze met Garen's. There was no sentimentality in it, no speeches about heroism, just a soldier acknowledging another soldier's choice. He nodded back once. The plan was crude but simple. Riva and what remained of the platoon would unleash everything they had, every last bolt, every grenade, every scrap of heavy ordnance, to draw the Tyranids' attention toward the bunker. Garen would use the chaos to slip through the rear trench network, circle around, and reach the creature from behind. He would plant the charge directly against its body this time, not the container. One clean blast. No timer. Manual detonation. It was suicide. Everyone knew it. But suicide was preferable to watching an entire planet drown in the swarm. The signal to move came in the form of the first breach. A tide of gaunts surged toward the bunker, shrieking. Lasguns opened up from the firing ports, stitching lines of light across the darkness. Heavy stubbers rattled to life, cutting swaths through the front ranks. Frag grenades exploded in muddy fountains. For a moment, it almost looked like the guard might hold. Then the bigger ones came. Warriors towering over the gaunts, their chitinous armor deflecting lasfire like rain. One crashed against the bunker wall, its claws gouging through ferrocrete. Another hurled a living projectile that splattered acid across the firing slit, forcing the gunners to duck back. The smell of burning flesh filled the air. Riva bellowed for the flamer teams, and jets of promethium roared out, turning the night into an inferno. The flames bought seconds, no more, but seconds were all Garen needed. He slipped out through the service hatch at the bunker's rear, into the chaos. The trench network behind the ridge was half-collapsed, waterlogged and crawling with wounded men trying to drag themselves to safety. He moved like a shadow, low and fast, mud splattering his uniform, heart hammering with the rhythm of distant gunfire. Everywhere he looked, the Imperium's lines were breaking. Vox units crackled with fragments of panicked messages. "Repeat, we need evac. They're through the southern wall. Emperor, forgive us." Each voice was another reminder that this wasn't a battle anymore. It was a last stand. He climbed out of the trench and pressed himself against a shattered supply truck for cover. Ahead, across a stretch of open, cratered ground, was the creature. It stood amidst the carnage like the eye of a storm. Tyranids swarmed past it, around it, but never too close. It was protected, not by walls, but by reverence. Garen could feel it in the air, the way the creatures moved around it, the way the swarm seemed to flow according to its silent will. He took a deep breath, then moved. The first stretch was easy. The Tyranids were focused on the bunker and the guards' desperate defense. Artillery shells still fell sporadically, though none close to the beacon anymore. He darted from crater to crater, staying low, his uniform blending with the mud and smoke. Then he hit the dead zone. 30 meters of open ground separated him from the creature. No cover, no trenches, just blasted earth and bodies. He paused at the lip of a crater, chest heaving, eyes fixed on the thing. Its head tilted slightly, almost like it was listening. The air around it shimmered faintly, like heat above a fire. He thought of turning back, just for a heartbeat. He could retreat to the bunker, die with the others in a hail of lasfire and claws. A clean soldier's death. But then he pictured the swarm spreading beyond this world. Hive ships descending on helpless cities. Billions devoured because he hadn't taken that last step. He ran. Mud sucked at his boots. Shell craters loomed like open mouths. He zigzagged to make himself a harder target, though he doubted it mattered against the will directing this army. Halfway across, one of the escorts spotted him, a warrior, its elongated head snapping toward his movement. It let out a bone-rattling screech, and several gaunts peeled away from the main swarm to intercept. Garen didn't slow. He yanked a frag grenade from his belt, thumbed the pin, and hurled it behind him without looking back. The explosion knocked him forward but took the pursuing gaunts with it. The warrior was still coming, claws tearing furrows into the mud. 20 meters. The childlike creature turned its gaze on him, black eyes deep and endless. Garen stumbled mid-stride as a voice, not a sound but a thought, pressed into his skull. Stop. He faltered just for a moment. It wasn't a command barked like an officer. It was gentle, almost curious. Like a child examining a bug crawling across its palm, his legs trembled. He felt memories being pulled from him, his homeworld's ochre skies, his mother's face, the smell of recaf during training mornings. One by one, they slipped through his fingers like sand. "No," he hissed through clenched teeth. He forced his legs forward again, every step a battle against the alien presence clawing at his mind. 10 meters. The warrior was nearly on him now. He could hear its claws slashing the air behind him. He didn't look back. He threw himself into a sliding dive, mud spraying around him, and came to rest at the creature's feet. Up close it was terrifyingly fragile and impossibly powerful all at once. The tubing that threaded through its limbs pulsed like veins. Its thin chest rose and fell slowly, each breath shuddering the air. Its head tilted again, eyes locking with his. He felt like it could see everything, his thoughts, his fears, the shape of his soul. He slammed the demolition charge against its side, right where the grafted tubing met pale flesh. His thumb hovered over the detonator. The child's lips moved. No sound came out, but the word echoed in his mind. Why? Garen froze just for a heartbeat. Because what answer could he give? Because the Imperium demanded it. Because humanity had to survive. Because if he didn't, everything he'd ever known would be consumed. Yes, he whispered aloud, though the word meant nothing and everything. The warrior's claws descended toward him. Garen pressed the detonator. A white flash engulfed everything. The sound came a heartbeat later, a thunderclap that rolled across the battlefield and drowned out the swarm's screeches. When Garen opened his eyes, he expected nothing. No light, no sound, no sensation at all, but instead there was heat, fierce and immediate, like lying too close to a forge. He coughed, choking on smoke and grit, vision swimming. The world had become a blur of scorched earth and drifting ash. The crater where the child creature had stood was now a gouged scar in the mud, still glowing faintly at the edges. Everything around it was still. The Tyranids had stopped. He blinked hard, trying to clear his sight. They stood frozen where they were, gaunts mid-scramble over the ridge, warriors half-turned toward the bunker, artillery beasts with their bloated launchers hanging limp. It was as if the entire swarm had been caught in a single moment and then abandoned by whatever drove it. Their heads twitched erratically, mandibles chattering without sound, movements disjointed and confused. Garen had expected death, but not this. He pushed himself upright, every muscle screaming, ears ringing from the blast. The demolition charge had gone off right against the creature. There was no trace of it left, just fragments of crystallized growth scattered like black glass, smoking gently in the rain that had begun to fall. For a few heartbeats, the only sound was that soft patter of water on ruined ground, hissing as it struck scorched surfaces. Then the Tyranids screamed. It wasn't the shrill hunting cries Garen had grown used to hearing in battle. This was something deeper, more primal, a sound like the wail of a wounded god, rolling across the battlefield and rattling his bones. The frozen swarm convulsed as if struck by an invisible lash. Then, like a tide suddenly reversed, they turned as one and began to run. Thousands of creatures poured away from the bunker, the ridge, the battlefield itself, retreating toward the dark horizon in a panicked, chaotic swarm. Discipline shattered, coordination gone. It was the opposite of everything the Tyranid hive mind was supposed to be, chaos where there had only ever been relentless precision. Garen stared, half collapsed in the mud, as the nightmare tide receded into the distance. He couldn't comprehend it. A hand gripped his shoulder suddenly. He flinched, instinctively reaching for his knife, but stopped when he saw Corin kneeling beside him, face smeared with soot and blood. "Throne, Garen, I thought you were dead," Corin rasped. Garen's voice came out rough, almost unrecognizable. "So did I." Riva arrived a moment later, limping heavily, one arm bound in a makeshift sling. Behind her, what was left of the platoon emerged from the bunker, fewer than 24 souls, filthy, wounded, but alive. They looked around at the empty battlefield with disbelief, like men waking from a nightmare that hadn't quite ended. What happened? Riva demanded, scanning the horizon. Why are they retreating? They don't retreat. Garen's gaze drifted back to the crater. I killed the beacon, he said simply. His voice cracked on the last word, and he didn't know why. Riva followed his gaze, and her usual iron composure faltered. She whispered something that sounded like a prayer, then straightened. We need to regroup. The upper lines might still be holding, if this is happening everywhere. A low rumble cut her off. It wasn't artillery. It was deeper, rolling through the ground like distant thunder. The rain thickened, turning the battlefield into a slick mire. Garen's heart, which had only just begun to slow, started pounding again. From the horizon, a shape was emerging, massive, towering, shifting like a living mountain. Riva went pale. Emperor, it's the hive ship. In the distance, beyond the retreating swarm, the colossal bioorganic structure loomed through the clouds, its tendrils piercing the ground like roots, drawing sustenance from the dying planet. Its surface was alive, writhing with smaller organisms, lights flickering beneath its flesh like veins. Even from kilometers away, its presence was suffocating. The Tyranids might have fled the battlefield, but their god-beast still watched. For a long moment no one spoke. Then Corin laughed, a dry, broken sound. We won the battle, he said, and the war is still lost. Riva clenched her jaw. Not yet. Vox the command net. Someone has to know what happened here. If killing that thing disrupted the swarm, we need to tell them. It might be the only weakness they have. The surviving Vox unit crackled to life, barely functioning after the bombardments. Corin worked the dials with shaking hands, broadcasting their message into the storm. Garen watched the hive ship through the rain, unable to tear his eyes away. It didn't move closer. It didn't need to. The implication hung heavy in the air. This was not over. The Imperium might have found a weapon, but the enemy would learn, adapt, and return. Hours passed before evacuation arrived. A battered Valkyrie gunship roared down through the clouds, skimming low over the broken terrain. Its side doors were blackened by acid, its engines coughing smoke, but it held together long enough to land near the bunker. Medici crews poured out, moving among the wounded like pale ghosts. As they lifted off, Garen stared down at the battlefield from the open hatch. The crater was a dark wound in the land. The swarm had truly gone, but the devastation remained. Trenches like veins carved into the mud, broken fortifications, and bodies everywhere. Too many bodies. The kind of losses the Administratum would record as acceptable on some distant data slate. Corin sat beside him, head tilted back against the bulkhead, eyes closed. You ever think about what happens after this? He asked suddenly. Garen glanced at him. After what? After we fight, after we win, if we ever win. Corin opened his eyes and stared at the rain streaking past the hatch. They'll just send us somewhere else. Another front, another world, another swarm. This never ends, does it? Garen didn't answer. He didn't have an answer. The truth hung between them, heavy and unspoken. The life of an Imperial guardsman wasn't about victory. It was about endurance. You fought, you survived, and if you were lucky, you died before the next war found you. When they reached orbit, the scale of the Tyranid invasion became clear. From the Valkyrie's viewport, Garen saw the void battle raging above the planet. Imperial cruisers trading fire with bioships, lance strikes cutting through the darkness like celestial spears. And beyond it all, the hive fleet drifted like an endless sea of nightmares, stretching farther than any eye could see. Their report was delivered to a grim-faced commissar and a handful of weary officers. They listened, took notes, and said nothing. Garen saw the moment of realization dawn on them when Riva described the beacon creature and its destruction. A flicker of something, hope, calculation, passed between them. Orders were whispered. Strategic discussions began. And then they were dismissed. Back in the barracks, Garen sat on the edge of his bunk, staring at his mud-caked boots. The noise of the ship was constant around him. Engine hum, distant announcements, the shuffle of thousands of bodies moving through narrow corridors. but his mind kept returning to that last moment in the mud, the child's eyes, the word in his head. Why? He didn't have an answer then. He didn't have one now. Outside the viewport, the hive fleet shifted, tendrils curling, preparing for its next move. The war was far from over, but somewhere deep inside, buried beneath exhaustion and grief, a tiny ember of defiance flickered. They had found a way to hurt it. That mattered. Riva passed by his bunk, pausing just long enough to squeeze his shoulder. No words, none were needed. The horrifying truth about life as an Imperial guard wasn't in the battles, or the blood, or the enemies. It was in the endlessness of it. The way hope was measured in moments stolen from the jaws of defeat. The way survival itself became both victory and curse. Garen lay back on the bunk, eyes fixed on the ceiling, and listened to the distant rumble of the ship preparing for its next jump. His muscles ached. His mind was frayed, but he was still breathing. For now, that was enough.